In the summer of 356 before the Common Era, on the 20th day of the month, the Greeks called Hekatombion, the ancient world witnessed the birth of a child who would reshape the boundaries of the known earth. The omens that accompanied Alexander's arrival into this world were as extraordinary as the life he would lead. On that very night, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground in a conflagration so fierce that the marble itself cracked and the gold decorations melted into rivers that ran through the streets. The goddess, so the priests later claimed when they emerged from their smoke-filled chambers, had been absent from her shrine, attending instead to the birth of the future conqueror. The head priest, an elderly man named Hegesias who had served the goddess for 40 years, would later write that he knew immediately upon seeing the flames that somewhere in the Greek world a force had been born that would consume nations as thoroughly as fire had consumed the temple. Lightning struck twice over the royal palace at Pella that night, leaving scorch marks on the stone that would remain visible for generations. The courtiers spent the following days examining the patterns, declaring that the double strike signified a child who would rule over 2 worlds, the Greek and the barbarian. Eagles, those mighty symbols of Zeus himself, circled endlessly above the Macedonian capital for 3 days following the birth, their cries echoing across the valley. One particularly large eagle, with wings that witnesses claimed spanned the length of 2 men, perched on the roof of the palace directly above the room where the infant lay, remaining there until sunset, as if standing guard over the newborn prince. His father, Philip II of Macedon, received word of his son's birth while campaigning against the Illyrians in the mountainous regions north of Macedonia. The messenger who brought the news had ridden for 2 days without rest, changing horses at every garrison, and collapsed from exhaustion after delivering his message. But he also carried 2 other pieces of extraordinary fortune that made his arduous journey worthwhile. Philip's most trusted general, Parmenion, had just defeated a combined force of Illyrians and Paeonians in a battle so decisive that both tribes had sent ambassadors seeking terms. Additionally, Philip's horse, a magnificent black stallion named Thunderbolt that he had personally trained, had won at the Olympic Games, bringing glory to Macedonia in the most prestigious venue in the Greek world. 3 victories in a single day seemed to promise a child blessed by the gods themselves. Philip, ever the pragmatist despite his appreciation for omens, is said to have remarked to his assembled officers that a son born under such auspices would either conquer the world or destroy it, attempting to do so. He ordered sacrifices to all the gods, particularly to Zeus and Heracles, the divine ancestor claimed by the Macedonian royal house. The celebrations in the military camp lasted 3 days, with Philip distributing bonuses to his soldiers and promising that his newborn son would lead them to glory greater than any Macedonian had ever known. The relationship between Alexander's parents was as complex as it was tumultuous, shaped by political necessity, personal passion, and ultimately, destructive jealousy. Philip of Macedon was a revolutionary military commander who had transformed Macedonia from a backwater kingdom constantly threatened by its neighbors into the dominant power of Greece. He bore the scars of his transformation of Macedonia like badges of honor. He had lost his right eye to an arrow during the siege of Methone, leaving a gruesome socket that he refused to cover, saying it reminded his enemies of his willingness to sacrifice for victory. His left shoulder carried a deep scar from an Illyrian sword that had nearly severed his arm. He walked with a pronounced limp from a Thracian spear that had pierced his thigh and damaged the bone, yet he could still mount a horse faster than most men half his age. Despite these physical imperfections, or perhaps because of them, Philip possessed a commanding presence that dominated any room he entered. His voice, trained on countless battlefields, could shift from a gentle whisper that drew listeners close to a roar that could be heard across a battlefield. His appetite for conquest was matched only by his appetite for women, and he had married 7 times, each marriage a political alliance that strengthened Macedonia's position. Yet of all his wives, it was Olympias who captured more than just his political interest. Olympias, Alexander's mother, was a princess of Epirus, a woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer temperament. She stood tall for a woman of her era, with striking features that poets compared to those of the goddess Hera herself. Her eyes, dark and penetrating, seemed to see through flesh and bone to the soul beneath, a quality that unnerved even hardened warriors. She claimed descent from Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles himself, making her bloodline among the most prestigious in the Greek world. But it was not her beauty or lineage that made her remarkable and dangerous. It was her involvement in mystery religions that even the liberal-minded Macedonians found unsettling. Olympias was an initiate of the Orphic mysteries and a devotee of Dionysian rites that involved snake handling and ecstatic trances. She kept serpents as pets, allowing them to wind around her arms and neck during religious ceremonies, and it was rumored that she slept with them in her bed. The Macedonian court, accustomed to straightforward religious practices, watched with a mixture of fascination and fear as she performed rituals that seemed to give her access to otherworldly knowledge. She would emerge from these ceremonies with prophecies that proved unnervingly accurate, speaking of future events with such certainty that even skeptics found themselves believing. From his earliest days, Alexander was caught between these two powerful personalities, each trying to shape him according to their own vision. Philip wanted to forge his son into a warrior king who could continue his legacy of Macedonian dominance. He would take the young Alexander to the training grounds before dawn, teaching him to wield a sword when the boy's arms were barely strong enough to lift the weapon. Philip believed that a king must be stronger, faster, and more skilled than any of his subjects, and he pushed Alexander relentlessly to achieve physical excellence. The training sessions were brutal. Philip would match Alexander against boys several years older, watching with critical eyes as his son was knocked down again and again. When Alexander complained that the matches were unfair, Philip responded that enemies on the battlefield would not concern themselves with fairness. Gradually, Alexander learned not just to fight, but to think tactically, to use his smaller size and greater speed to his advantage. By the age of 10, he could defeat opponents who towered over him, having learned to read their movements and exploit their overconfidence. Olympias, meanwhile, whispered to her son of divine heritage, telling him that Zeus himself, not Philip, was his true father. She would take him to her private shrine at night, where the air was thick with incense and the walls were painted with scenes of gods and heroes. There, by the flickering light of oil lamps, she told him the story of his conception. She spoke of the snake that had been seen in her bed before Alexander's birth, a great serpent with scales that shimmered like gold in the moonlight. This was no ordinary snake, she insisted, but Zeus himself in one of his divine forms, come to father a child who would surpass all mortal men. She taught him the stories of heroes who were born of gods and mortals, particularly Heracles, who had completed impossible labors and been granted immortality. She showed him secret texts that spoke of destiny and divine will, teaching him to read omens in the flight of birds and the patterns of sacrificial smoke. Whether Alexander truly believed these stories, or simply found them useful for his later propaganda, we cannot say with certainty. What we do know is that from childhood he possessed an unshakable belief in his own destiny, a conviction that he was meant for something greater than ordinary kingship. The young prince's education began as befitted a Macedonian noble, but with an intensity that surpassed normal aristocratic training. He learned to ride before he could properly walk, placed on horseback by Philip himself, who held him steady as the horse walked in circles. By age 5, he could control a horse independently, and by 7, he was jumping obstacles that grown men found challenging. His riding instructor, an old cavalryman named Leonidas, who was actually a relative of Olympias, was notorious for his harsh methods. He would make Alexander ride without a saddle in the rain and snow, saying that a true horseman must be one with his mount in any conditions. Weapons training was equally rigorous. Alexander learned not just the Macedonian fighting style, but techniques from across the known world. Philip brought in instructors from Thrace to teach him the use of the curved sword, from Crete to demonstrate archery techniques, from Sparta to show him the finer points of hoplite combat. The boy showed remarkable aptitude, but it was with the sarissa, the long Macedonian pike that Philip had made the cornerstone of his military reforms, that Alexander truly excelled. He could manipulate the 18-foot weapon with a grace that belied its unwieldy length, understanding instinctively how to use its reach while compensating for its limitations in close combat. But Philip, despite his reputation as a rough warrior who had spent more nights in military camps than in palaces, understood that ruling an empire required more than military prowess. He had seen too many conquests crumble because the conqueror knew only how to destroy, not how to build. When Alexander reached 13, Philip made a decision that would profoundly shape not only his son, but the entire Hellenistic world that would follow. He summoned Aristotle, the philosopher who had studied under Plato himself and was already gaining recognition as one of the greatest minds of the age, to serve as Alexander's tutor. The negotiations to bring Aristotle to Macedonia were complex and revealing of Philip's sophistication. Aristotle's hometown of Stagira had been destroyed by Philip during his expansion, its citizens enslaved or scattered. As part of the agreement to secure Aristotle's services, Philip agreed to rebuild the city and return its exiled citizens. the philosopher arrived in Macedonia not as a mere employee, but as an honored guest, provided with resources that would have been the envy of any scholar in Athens. The meeting of these two minds, the future conqueror and the greatest thinker of the age, took place at Mieza, a village near Pella where Philip had prepared a school in a grove sacred to the nymphs. The location was chosen carefully, far enough from court to avoid distractions, but close enough for Philip to monitor his son's progress. The school building itself was a marvel, with a library that Philip had stocked with texts from across the Greek world, including rare works that had been copied specifically for Alexander's education. Maps covered the walls, showing not just the Greek world but the vast expanse of the Persian Empire and the mysterious lands beyond. For 3 years, from age 13 to 16, Aristotle instructed Alexander and a carefully selected group of noble companions who would later become his generals and administrators. These included Hephaestion, already Alexander's closest friend, Ptolemy, who would one day rule Egypt, Cassander, son of Philip's general Antipater, and several others who would help shape the Hellenistic world. The bonds formed in this scholarly grove would endure through conquests and across continents, creating a brotherhood that shared not just military experiences but intellectual foundations. The curriculum was comprehensive beyond anything typical for the era. Alexander studied medicine with a thoroughness that would allow him to personally treat wounded soldiers in his campaigns. Aristotle taught him to identify medicinal plants, to diagnose common diseases, to set broken bones, and to perform basic surgery. This medical knowledge would prove invaluable in the field, where Alexander's ability to tend to his men's wounds personally would strengthen their loyalty and demonstrate his care for their welfare. He learned botany and zoology, developing a fascination with the natural world that would lead him to send specimens back to Aristotle from the far corners of his empire. During his campaigns, Alexander would often pause to examine unusual plants or animals, questioning local experts about their properties and uses. He established what might be considered the first systematic biological survey, ordering his administrators to collect and document the flora and fauna of conquered territories. The information gathered would contribute to Aristotle's groundbreaking works on natural history. The study of philosophy occupied many hours, with Aristotle introducing Alexander to questions of ethics, politics, and metaphysics. They discussed the nature of justice, the best forms of government, the relationship between ruler and ruled. Aristotle taught his pupil his theory of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes. Alexander would later claim to follow this principle, though his actions often suggested a nature that tended toward extremes rather than moderation. They debated whether some men were naturally suited to rule while others were meant to serve, a concept that would influence Alexander's approach to governing his diverse empire. Mathematics and geometry were taught not as abstract concepts but as practical tools for warfare and administration. Alexander learned to calculate the supplies needed for armies of various sizes, to determine the time required to march certain distances, to engineer siege works and bridges. His later campaigns would demonstrate an almost uncanny ability to solve logistical problems that had defeated other commanders, moving large armies through hostile territory with a precision that seemed impossible. But it was Homer's Iliad that captured Alexander's imagination most completely. Aristotle prepared a special edition of the epic for his pupil, annotated with his own commentary on military tactics, leadership, and heroic virtue. This text, which became known as the casket copy because Alexander would later keep it in a precious casket captured from Darius, would accompany him throughout his conquests. He memorized long passages, able to recite hundreds of lines from memory. He saw himself in Achilles, the hero who chose eternal glory over a long, peaceful life. The parallel was reinforced by his mother's claimed ancestry, making Achilles not just his hero but his supposed ancestor. This identification with Achilles would influence countless decisions throughout his life. Like Achilles, Alexander would demonstrate both incredible courage and terrible rage. Like Achilles, he would form an intense bond with a beloved companion whose death would drive him to extremes of grief. Like Achilles, he would struggle with the tension between his divine nature and human limitations. The Iliad became not just a favorite story, but a script for his life, a template for heroic action that he would follow even when it led to destructive consequences. Under Aristotle's tutelage, Alexander also developed his understanding of politics and governance. The philosopher taught him about the various forms of government, from monarchy to democracy, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses. They studied the constitutions of different Greek cities, examining why some prospered while others fell into chaos. Aristotle introduced him to the concept of the philosopher king, the ideal ruler who combined wisdom with power. While Aristotle probably intended this as a theoretical exercise, Alexander seems to have taken it as a personal challenge. The relationship between teacher and student was not merely academic. Aristotle became a father figure to Alexander in ways that Philip, often absent on campaign, could not be. They would walk together through the grove at Mieza, discussing not just formal lessons but life itself. Aristotle shared his own experiences at Plato's academy, his years at the Macedonian court as a young man, his observations of human nature. He taught Alexander to question, to analyze, to seek truth through reason rather than accepting received wisdom. Yet there was always a tension in Alexander between Aristotle's intellectual influence and the raw Macedonian warrior culture embodied by his father. He could discuss philosophy with the subtlety of an Athenian intellectual while drinking unmixed wine like a Thracian warrior. He could appreciate Persian art and Indian wisdom while maintaining the fierce pride of a Macedonian king. This duality would define his character throughout his life, making him both more sophisticated and more dangerous than a simple conqueror. At 16, Alexander's formal education ended when Philip appointed him regent of Macedonia while he campaigned against Byzantium. It was a remarkable demonstration of trust, placing the kingdom in the hands of a teenager. But it was also a test, one that Philip had carefully prepared. He left experienced advisors to guide Alexander, but made it clear that final decisions rested with his son. The Macedonian nobles watched carefully, ready to exploit any sign of weakness in the young prince. Alexander passed the test spectacularly. When the Mede tribe revolted, thinking they could take advantage of the king's absence and the youth of his region, Alexander responded with a speed and decisiveness that would become his trademark. Rather than waiting for his father's return or seeking permission to act, he immediately assembled a force from the troops left to defend Macedonia. His advisors counseled caution, suggesting he simply contain the revolt until Philip returned. Alexander ignored them. The campaign against the Mede lasted less than a month, but demonstrated Alexander's emerging military genius. He force-marched his troops through difficult terrain, appearing before the Mede stronghold before they had finished their defensive preparations. When they retreated to their fortified capital, Alexander began a siege that combined traditional Macedonian techniques with innovations of his own design. He used feinted attacks to draw defenders to one section of the walls while the real assault came from another direction. The city fell in days rather than the weeks or months such sieges usually required. But it was what Alexander did after the victory that truly announced his arrival as a force to be reckoned with. Rather than simply accepting tribute and leaving a garrison, as was customary, he completely destroyed the Mede capital and founded a new city on its ruins. He named it Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that would bear his name. He populated it with Macedonian settlers and loyal locals, creating a permanent Macedonian presence in previously hostile territory. The message was clear that Alexander would not simply defeat enemies, but would transform the very landscape of their defeat. The relationship between father and son grew increasingly strained as Alexander matured and demonstrated his capabilities. Philip was proud of his son's achievements, but perhaps also threatened by them. The young prince was everything a Macedonian king should be, handsome where Philip was scarred, eloquent where Philip was blunt, beloved by the troops who saw in him the promise of even greater glory than his father had achieved. The tension was exacerbated by Olympias, who constantly reminded Alexander that he was destined for greater things than being Philip's successor. The court at Pella became a battleground of subtle conflicts and not so subtle rivalries. Philip's other wives and their children represented potential threats to Alexander's succession. The Macedonian succession was not strictly hereditary. The assembly of nobles had to approve the new king, and a weak or unpopular heir could be passed over for a more suitable candidate. Alexander had to constantly prove himself worthy while avoiding appearing too ambitious, a delicate balance that required political skills as sophisticated as any military tactics. The tension exploded at Philip's wedding feast when he married Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman. The marriage was problematic for multiple reasons. Unlike Philip's other marriages, which were to foreign princesses for diplomatic purposes, this was to a Macedonian noble family, potentially producing heirs with pure Macedonian blood. Cleopatra was also young and beautiful, suggesting this marriage was driven by passion rather than politics. Most dangerously, her family was ambitious and immediately began positioning themselves for greater power. The wedding feast was a lavish affair, with nobles from across Macedonia and Greece in attendance. Wine flowed freely, the strong, unmixed wine that Macedonians prided themselves on drinking. As the evening progressed and inhibitions lowered, Cleopatra's uncle Attalus, himself drunk on wine and newfound proximity to power, proposed a toast. He called on the Macedonians to pray that Philip and Cleopatra would produce a legitimate heir to the throne. The implication was clear and insulting that Alexander, son of the Epirote Olympius, was somehow less than fully Macedonian, perhaps even illegitimate. The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to Alexander, waiting to see how the young prince would respond to this public insult. Alexander's face flushed with rage, and he hurled his cup at Attalus, the metal vessel clanging across the floor. He shouted across the hall, demanding whether Attalus was calling him a bastard. The word hung in the air like a drawn sword. Attalus, too drunk to recognize the danger, began to respond, but Philip, also drunk and furious at the disruption of his wedding, lurched to his feet. What happened next became one of the most famous scenes in ancient history. Philip, the man who had conquered Greece, who had transformed Macedonia into a superpower, drew his sword and stumbled toward his son. But his old leg wound and the wine betrayed him. He tripped and fell sprawling on the floor, his sword clattering away. Alexander, his voice dripping with contempt, looked down at his father and declared to the wedding guests that here was the man who planned to cross from Europe to Asia, yet could not even cross from one couch to another. The insult was devastating, not just personally but politically. It questioned Philip's capability to lead the planned invasion of Persia, suggesting that the great conqueror was now a drunk old man who could not even walk straight. The silence that followed was deafening. Philip's guards did not know whether to help their fallen king or arrest the prince who had insulted him. The wedding guests sat frozen, witnesses to a family tragedy that was also a political crisis. After this confrontation, Alexander and Olympias fled to Epirus that very night. The exile was brief but significant. It demonstrated to the Macedonian nobility that Alexander would not quietly accept any diminishment of his position. It also showed that he had support, nobles who helped him leave and kept him informed of events in Macedonia. Philip, once he sobered up, recognized the danger of alienating his most capable son and heir. The planned invasion of Persia required stability in Macedonia, and Alexander's exile was creating dangerous uncertainty. The reconciliation was orchestrated by Demaratus of Corinth, a family friend who served as an intermediary. He supposedly asked Philip how he could hope to bring harmony to Greece when he could not maintain it in his own household. The logic was irrefutable. Philip invited Alexander to return, though the relationship between them never fully recovered. Trust was broken, and both men knew it. Alexander returned to court, but he and his supporters remained vigilant for any sign that Philip might try to replace him as heir. The final break came 2 years later at the wedding of Alexander's sister, also named Cleopatra, to Alexander of Epirus. The marriage was partly an attempt to secure Olympias's family's loyalty despite the recent tensions. The ceremony was to be held at Aegae, the ancient capital of Macedonia, with dignitaries from across Greece attending. Philip planned it as a spectacular demonstration of Macedonian power and wealth, a preview of the glory that would come with the Persian expedition. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, seemingly blessed by the gods. Philip had arranged for a magnificent procession into the theater where the ceremony would occur. Statues of the 12 Olympian gods were carried in, and then, in a gesture of supreme confidence or hubris, a 13th statue, that of Philip himself. The message was clear that Philip saw himself as equal to the gods, or at least worthy of similar veneration. As Philip entered the theater, he walked between his son Alexander and his new son-in-law, also named Alexander. In a fateful decision, he had dismissed his bodyguards, wanting to show his confidence and accessibility to the gathered dignitaries from across Greece. He wore a white cloak that made him stand out brilliantly in the morning sun. The crowd rose to applaud the king who had made Macedonia great. From the crowd of royal pages, a young noble named Pausanias suddenly rushed forward. Before anyone could react, he plunged a Celtic dagger between Philip's ribs, finding the gap in his ceremonial armor with practiced precision. Philip died almost instantly, his white cloak turning red with blood. Pausanias fled toward horses that had been prepared for his escape, suggesting a well-planned assassination rather than a spontaneous act. But as he ran through the vineyard behind the theater, he tripped on a vine and was killed by pursuing guards before he could reveal any co-conspirators. The assassination scene erupted in chaos. Some guards pursued Pausanias, others surrounded Philip's body, still others moved to protect the two Alexanders. The crowd of dignitaries, moments before celebrating a royal wedding, now witnessed a regicide. In the confusion, Alexander took control with remarkable presence of mind. He immediately secured the loyalty of the guards present, particularly Antipater and Parmenion, Philip's most trusted generals. By the time Philip's body had grown cold, Alexander was already acting as king. The motivations behind Pausanias' actions remained debated. He had personal grievances against Philip, having been sexually assaulted by Attilus's men in a complex story of court intrigue and revenge. Philip had failed to provide justice, choosing political expediency over righteousness, but many suspected deeper conspiracies. Olympias was suspected because she benefited from Philip's death and later honored Pausanias' corpse. Alexander himself was suspected, though he was standing next to Philip when the assassination occurred. The Persian Empire had motive to eliminate the man planning to invade them. The truth died with Pausanias. Alexander's response was swift and ruthless, demonstrating a political cunning that matched his military genius. Within hours of Philip's death, he had secured the support of the key military commanders. At 20 years old, he found himself king of Macedonia, but his throne was far from secure. The Macedonian assembly quickly confirmed his succession, but rivals emerged immediately. The succession was not automatic, and other members of the royal family had claims that some nobles might support. Attalus, who had insulted Alexander at Philip's wedding, was commanding troops in Asia Minor as part of the advance force for the Persian expedition. He represented a significant threat, with an army at his disposal and reasons to oppose Alexander's succession. Alexander sent Hecataeus, a trusted agent, supposedly to negotiate with Attalus, but actually with secret orders. When Attalus showed any hesitation in acknowledging Alexander as king, Hecataeus had him assassinated. The message to other potential rivals was clear that opposition meant death. Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter by Philip were murdered, probably on Olympias's orders, though Alexander claimed no knowledge of it. The brutality was shocking even by Macedonian standards. Olympias supposedly forced Cleopatra to hang herself after making her watch her infant daughter killed. Whether Alexander truly knew nothing of his mother's plans or simply maintained plausible deniability, he benefited from the elimination of potential rival claimants. 2 princes of Lyncestis were executed for alleged involvement in Philip's assassination, though the evidence against them was circumstantial at best. Only Alexander Lyncestis was spared, primarily because he was married to Antipater's daughter and had been among the first to hail Alexander as king. Amyntas, son of Philip's older brother and thus with a strong claim to the throne, was also eliminated. Within weeks, Alexander had removed all potential rival claimants to the throne through death or exile. But Macedonia itself was only part of Alexander's inheritance. Philip had spent 20 years establishing Macedonian hegemony over Greece, and with his death, the Greek cities saw an opportunity for freedom. The news of Philip's assassination spread through Greece like wildfire, and reactions were immediate and predictable. The Athenians celebrated Philip's death in the streets, voting honors for Pausanias even though he was already dead. The Thebans expelled their Macedonian garrison and began fortifying their city. The Spartans, though weakened from their defeat at Leuctra decades earlier, began stirring up resistance in the Peloponnese. Even in the north, the Thracian and Illyrian tribes that Philip had subdued were preparing to revolt. They had submitted to Philip's strength, but a 20-year-old boy was a different matter. The Triballians began raiding Macedonian territory. The Illyrians reformed their armies. The Paeonians demanded the return of territory Philip had taken. Macedonia was surrounded by enemies who sensed weakness and opportunity. Many experienced advisors, including Antipater and Parmenion, counseled the young king to proceed cautiously, to secure Macedonia before dealing with external threats. They suggested diplomacy, concessions, buying time to consolidate power. Alexander did exactly the opposite. With characteristic speed that would become his military trademark, he marched south with his army before the Greeks could organize their resistance. He moved so quickly that he reached Thessaly before news of his approach preceded him. The Thessalians, who controlled the crucial passes into central Greece, had been debating whether to assert their independence. Alexander's sudden appearance ended that debate. He reminded them of their oaths to Philip, and, more importantly, demonstrated that the Macedonian army remained formidable regardless of who commanded it. He forced his way through Thermopylae, the famous pass where 300 Spartans had once held off the Persian army. The symbolic value was immense. Alexander was declaring himself the defender of Greece, just as the Spartans had been against the Persians. The speed of his advance caught the Greeks completely unprepared. Cities that had been planning resistance found Alexander at their gates before they had finished their preparations. By the time they could react, Alexander was already in central Greece, his army intact and ready for battle. The Athenians, who had been celebrating Philip's death and voting honors for his assassin, suddenly found themselves in a precarious position. Their citizen army was no match for the Macedonian phalanx, and their walls, while formidable, had not stopped Philip and would not stop his son. They sent ambassadors seeking forgiveness, led by Demosthenes, the orator who had spent years warning against Macedonian power. Alexander, showing political wisdom beyond his years, pardoned them. He needed Athens's naval power for his planned invasion of Persia, and destroying Athens would turn him from a Hellenic leader into a tyrant in Greek eyes. At Corinth, Alexander called a meeting of the League that Philip had established after defeating the Greeks at Chaeronea. The young king demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. He could have imposed harsh terms on the Greeks, punishing them for their celebration of his father's death and their attempted revolts. Instead, he simply requested that the League confirm him in his father's position as hegemon, supreme commander for the planned invasion of Persia. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as the continuer of Philip's pan-Hellenic crusade against the Persian Empire. The Greeks, relieved that the young king was not seeking vengeance and perhaps seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Macedonian troops by sending them to Asia, readily agreed. Only Sparta refused to join, maintaining their proud tradition of independence. The Spartans declared that their ancestors had never followed others but had always led. Alexander, showing strategic restraint that Philip would have appreciated, chose to ignore this defiance rather than waste resources forcing Spartan submission. A campaign against Sparta would be costly and would delay the Persian expedition. Better to leave them in their isolation, a living reminder of former glory but no real threat to Macedonian hegemony. It was at Corinth that Alexander encountered the famous philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. Diogenes lived in deliberate poverty, rejecting all social conventions and material possessions. He slept in a large ceramic jar and owned nothing but a cloak and staff. When Alexander found him, the philosopher was lying in the sun, basking like a cat. The young king, educated by Aristotle and respectful of philosophy, approached with his entourage of officers and courtiers. The contrast could not have been more stark, the most powerful man in Greece standing before one who had rejected all power. Alexander asked if there was anything he could do for the famous thinker, perhaps expecting a request for gold or favor, or at least acknowledgement of his generosity. Diogenes, without even sitting up, replied that yes, Alexander could stop blocking his sunlight. The king's companions were outraged at this disrespect. Here was the hegemon of Greece, the king of Macedonia, offering favor to a man who lived in a jar and receiving insult in return. They waited for Alexander to order punishment for such insolence. Instead, Alexander reportedly said that if he were not Alexander, he would choose to be Diogenes. This response, whether historical or apocryphal, illustrates Alexander's complex character. He could appreciate those who showed no deference to power, perhaps because so few people in his life could treat him as anything other than a prince or king. In Diogenes, he saw someone who had achieved a different kind of freedom, liberation from desire and ambition. Of course, Alexander would never choose such a life. His nature drove him toward conquest and glory, but he could recognize and respect its philosophical validity. With Greece temporarily subdued, Alexander turned north to secure Macedonia's other borders before embarking on the Persian expedition. The campaign of 335 before the Common Era demonstrated the military genius that would soon terrorize the Persian Empire. The Thracian tribes had fortified Mount Haemus, modern-day Balkan mountains, convinced that no army could force the passes they controlled. They had not reckoned with Alexander's determination and innovative tactics. Alexander marched his army over 200 miles in just over a week, a pace that exhausted his men but brought him to Mount Haemus before the Thracians had completed their preparations. The tribesmen had positioned themselves on the high ground, with a formidable defensive position. They had collected wagons loaded with rocks, planning to roll them down the steep slopes at the advancing Macedonians. It was a simple but potentially devastating tactic that had worked against previous invaders. When the Thracians rolled the wagons down the mountainside at his troops, Alexander's response demonstrated his ability to think creatively under pressure. He ordered his men to lie flat where the ground permitted, locking their shields over themselves like a tortoise shell. Where the ground was too uneven for this maneuver, he had them open their ranks to create lanes through which the wagons could pass harmlessly. The wagons thundered down the slope, crashing and bouncing, but the Macedonian discipline held. Not a single soldier was killed by what should have been a devastating attack. The psychological effect on the Thracians was profound. They had expected to see the Macedonian ranks shattered, bodies crushed under the wagons, survivors fleeing in panic. Instead, they watched their best tactical advantage neutralized by disciplined execution of an improvised counter-tactic. When Alexander then led his men up the slope in a fierce charge, many Thracians fled without fighting. The pass was taken with minimal casualties, and Alexander marched through the mountains that were supposed to be impassable. After subduing the Thracians, Alexander learned that the Tribalians, another troublesome tribe, had positioned themselves on an island in the Danube River. The river was wide and fast-flowing, and Alexander had no boats. Most commanders would have negotiated or waited for the Tribalians to come to the mainland. Alexander did neither. In a single night, he had his men stuff their leather tents with hay to create makeshift rafts. He gathered every fishing boat and dugout canoe from the local population. Then, under cover of darkness, he ferried 1,500 cavalry and 4,000 infantry across one of Europe's great rivers. The Tribalians woke to find Alexander's army on their island, having achieved what they thought impossible. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical advantage. If Alexander could cross the Danube in a single night, what barrier could stop him? The Tribalians surrendered without significant resistance, and word spread throughout the region that this young Macedonian king possessed almost supernatural abilities. But Alexander's most brilliant strategic maneuver of this northern campaign came when facing a coalition of Illyrian and Taulantian forces. King Clitus of the Illyrians and King Glaucius of the Taulantians had united their armies and held superior positions in the hills around the fortified city of Pelium. Alexander found himself potentially trapped, with enemy forces on the high ground and his supply lines threatened. Many commanders would have retreated to fight on more favorable terrain. Instead, Alexander put on one of the most extraordinary displays in military history. He assembled his phalanx in the plain visible to the enemy forces and began to drill them in complete silence. For hours, the Macedonian infantry performed complex maneuvers with perfect precision. They wheeled left and right, formed from column into line and back again, raised and lowered their sarissas in perfect unison. Not a word was spoken, not a command shouted. The only sounds were the tramping of feet and the swish of weapons moving through the air. The Illyrians and Taulantians watched from their hills, mesmerized by this display of disciplined precision. They had never seen anything like it. Their own armies were brave but undisciplined, relying on individual warrior prowess rather than coordinated unit tactics. As the silent drill continued, their confidence eroded. If the Macedonians could maintain such discipline in drill, what would they be like in battle? Then, at a predetermined signal, the entire Macedonian army gave a tremendous war cry and beat their spears against their shields. The sudden explosion of sound after hours of silence was shocking. Many of the tribal warriors, already unnerved by the display, fled immediately. Others retreated to what they thought were safer positions. Alexander had achieved tactical advantage through pure psychological warfare without losing a single man. He then executed a feigned retreat, drawing the enemy forces down from their advantageous positions onto ground where the Macedonian tactical superiority could be fully employed. When the tribal armies pursued what they thought was a fleeing enemy, Alexander wheeled his forces and struck with devastating effect. The Illyrian and Taulantian armies were shattered, their kings barely escaping with their lives. The northern borders of Macedonia were secure. But while Alexander was campaigning in the north, demonstrating his military genius to barbarian tribes, a crisis was developing in Greece that would require a very different kind of demonstration. A rumor spread through the Greek cities that Alexander had been killed fighting the Illyrians. The source of the rumor was unclear, though some suspected Persian gold was spreading disinformation to destabilize Macedonia. Demosthenes in Athens claimed to have an eyewitness to Alexander's death, a merchant who had supposedly seen the young king fall in battle. Thebes, the great city of Boeotia, decided this was their moment to throw off the Macedonian yoke. They had particular grievances against Macedonia. Philip had garrisoned their citadel after the Battle of Chaeronea, a constant reminder of their subjugation. The presence of Macedonian troops in the Cadmea, their sacred citadel where Cadmus had supposedly founded the city, was especially galling. Encouraged by promises of support from Athens and other Greek cities, the Thebans rose in revolt. The Theban democracy voted to besiege the Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea and to restore their ancient constitution. They sent ambassadors throughout Greece, calling for a general uprising against Macedonian tyranny. They invoked the memory of Epaminondas, their great general who had once humbled Sparta. They reminded Greeks of their victory over the Spartans at Leuctra, proving that disciplined Greek hoplites could defeat any enemy. The Sacred Band, their elite force of 300 warriors, was reformed. Alexander's response was so swift that the Thebans initially refused to believe the Macedonian army approaching their walls was led by Alexander himself. He had force-marched his army from the Danube to Thebes, covering 500 miles in just 13 days. It was a logistical achievement as impressive as any battle victory. The Thebans insisted Alexander must be dead, and this must be another Alexander, perhaps Antipater's son. Even when Macedonian heralds announced that King Alexander demanded their surrender, some Thebans claimed it was an impostor. Alexander offered terms that were remarkably lenient considering the circumstances. He demanded only that the Thebans surrender the leaders of the revolt and acknowledge Macedonian hegemony. He understood that destroying Thebes would damage his reputation as a pan-Hellenic leader and might drive other Greek cities to desperate resistance. But the Thebans, confident in their famous walls and their reputation as fierce fighters, refused. They had defeated Sparta at the height of its power. Surely they could defeat a boy king who had been fighting barbarians. The Theban walls were formidable, among the strongest in Greece. They had been rebuilt and strengthened after various sieges, incorporating the latest defensive innovations. The Thebans had stockpiled supplies for a long siege and believed they could hold out until other Greek cities joined their revolt. They made one fatal error. They underestimated both Alexander's determination and his tactical brilliance. The siege of Thebes lasted only a few days, but would resonate through history for millennia. Alexander identified a weakness in the Theban defenses, a section of wall that was being repaired and was protected only by a wooden palisade. While making ostentatious preparations for assault on the main gates, drawing Theban defenders to that sector, he secretly prepared a strike force to hit the weak point. The assault, when it came, was coordinated with precision that the Thebans had not expected. The attack on the main gates drew defenders as planned, then the strike force hit the weak section. At the same time, the Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea, which had been under siege, made a sortie. The Thebans found themselves fighting on multiple fronts. The fighting was brutal and desperate. The Thebans fought with the courage of men defending their homes and families, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Once Macedonian troops were inside the walls, the battle became a massacre. Ancient sources claim 6,000 Thebans died in the fighting and 30,000 were enslaved. The Macedonians were not the only ones involved in the slaughter. Thebes' traditional enemies from other Boeotian cities, particularly Plataea and Orchomenus, joined enthusiastically in the destruction. Old grudges and rivalries turned what might have been a military defeat into complete annihilation. Alexander made the calculated decision to let the League of Corinth decide Thebes' fate, knowing full well what their decision would be. It was a clever political move that shifted responsibility from him personally to the Greek allies. The League's verdict was harsh beyond measure. The city that had sided with the Persians during Xerxes' invasion, that had dominated and oppressed its neighbors for generations, found no mercy. The city was to be razed to the ground, its territory divided among its neighbors, its population sold into slavery. Alexander did make some exceptions that revealed his education and cultural sensibilities. The temples were to be spared, respecting the gods even in destruction. The house of Pindar, the great poet whom Alexander admired, was to be left standing. Any Thebans who could prove they had opposed the revolt were pardoned, but these exceptions only highlighted the totality of the destruction. Thebes, the city of Oedipus and Antigone, the city of Epaminondas and Pelopidas, the city that had once been the greatest power in Greece, was simply erased from existence. The shock resonated throughout Greece like an earthquake. If Thebes could be destroyed, no city was safe. Athens immediately sent ambassadors begging forgiveness for their encouragement of the revolt. The Athenians had voted to send aid to Thebes, but had delayed, waiting to see the outcome. Now they prostrated themselves before Alexander, praising his mercy and wisdom. Alexander pardoned them again, but the message was clear. The young king could be merciful to those who submitted, but those who resisted faced annihilation. The destruction of Thebes served multiple strategic purposes beyond simply punishing rebellion. It eliminated a potential center of resistance in Greece while Alexander was campaigning in Asia. It demonstrated to the Persian Empire that Alexander was ruthless enough to destroy even Greek cities if necessary. It provided a massive influx of funds from the slave sales, helping finance the upcoming Persian expedition. And perhaps most importantly, it created a psychological impact that would resonate throughout his campaigns. Cities from Greece to India would remember Thebes when deciding whether to resist or surrender. With Greece thoroughly cowed into submission and Macedonia's borders secure, Alexander could finally turn to the great enterprise his father had planned, the invasion of the Persian Empire. The preparations were meticulous and revealing of Alexander's attention to detail. He knew he was attempting something that had never been successfully done before. The Persian Empire was the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from the Aegean Sea to India, from the Caucasus to Egypt. Its resources dwarfed anything Macedonia could muster. Its armies, when fully mobilized, could field hundreds of thousands of troops. The financial preparations alone were staggering. Alexander inherited a treasury that Philip had carefully built up, but also significant debts from military preparations. He borrowed heavily against future conquests, displaying supreme confidence in victory. He distributed land grants to his companions, leading Perdiccas to ask what Alexander was keeping for himself. Hope, the king replied, demonstrating the psychological dimension of his leadership. He was asking men to follow him to the ends of the earth based on trust in his destiny. Alexander's army, when it crossed the Hellespont in 334 before the Common Era, was a carefully balanced force of approximately 35,000 men. The Macedonian phalanx formed the infantry corps, 12,000 veterans armed with the sarissa. These men had been trained since childhood in the disciplined formations that Philip had perfected. They could march 30 miles in a day carrying full equipment and still fight a battle at the end of it. Their esprit de corps was unmatched, each man knowing that his life depended on the man beside him maintaining formation. 3,000 hypaspists served as elite infantry, capable of fighting either in phalanx formation or as more mobile troops. These were the best of the Macedonian infantry, selected for their strength, skill, and loyalty. They served as Alexander's guards in camp and his strike force in battle. They received extra pay and privileges but were expected to undertake the most dangerous missions. Their commander, Nicanor, was Parmenion's son, ensuring loyalty through family bonds that characterized Alexander's command structure. 7,000 allied Greeks accompanied the expedition, their loyalty questionable, but their presence politically necessary. Alexander used them primarily for garrison duty, keeping them away from main battles where their reliability might be tested. They served as hostages for their city's good behavior as much as military assets. 7,000 Thracians, Illyrians, and other tribal warriors provided light infantry and scouts. They were fierce but undisciplined, useful for pursuit and raiding, but unreliable in set battles. The cavalry, Alexander's primary strike force, numbered about 5,000 total. The 1,800 companion cavalry were the elite Macedonian nobles who formed the finest heavy cavalry in the ancient world. They wore bronze breastplates and helmets, but were not as heavily armored as later medieval knights, maintaining mobility over pure protection. Their primary weapon was the xyston, a cornel wood lance that could be used for both thrusting and throwing. These men had grown up with Alexander, trained with him, and would follow him anywhere. The Thessalian cavalry, about 1,800 strong, were nearly as good as the companions and served as Alexander's second strike force. The remaining cavalry were light horsemen from various allied and mercenary contingents, useful for scouting and pursuit, but not for the decisive charge. Alexander's innovative use of combined arms, coordinating cavalry charges with phalanx advances, would prove devastating against Persian forces accustomed to less sophisticated tactics. This army was revolutionary not just in its composition, but in its support structure. Alexander brought engineers capable of building siege equipment on site, reducing the need to transport heavy machinery. He had surveyors and cartographers to map new territories, creating the most accurate geographical knowledge of the ancient world. Scientists accompanied the expedition to study flora, fauna, and minerals, sending samples back to Aristotle. Historians recorded events, though their accounts would often be more propaganda than objective history. The crossing of the Hellespont was staged with deliberate symbolism that revealed Alexander's understanding of propaganda and myth-making. While the army crossed on transport ships, Alexander steered his own ship across the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. He wore full armor and stood at the prow like a hero from Homer. As the Asian shore approached, he hurled his spear onto the beach, claiming Asia as spear-won territory in the ancient tradition. He was the first to leap ashore, demonstrating the personal leadership that would characterize his entire campaign. Immediately after landing, Alexander made a pilgrimage to Troy, the site of the great war that dominated Greek imagination. The city Homer described had long since disappeared, but a small town maintained the tourist trade, showing visitors the supposed tomb of Achilles and other legendary sites. Alexander ran naked around Achilles' tomb, as was the custom, and placed a wreath on it while Hephaestus honored Patroclus' memorial. The parallel was obvious and intentional. Alexander was the new Achilles, come to finish what the Greek heroes had started, the conquest of Asia. At the temple of Athena at Troy, Alexander dedicated his own armor and took in exchange weapons supposedly from the Trojan War. These ancient arms, whether authentic or not, would be carried before him in battle by special bearers. They served as tangible links to the heroic past he sought to emulate and surpass. He also sacrificed to Priam, the Trojan king killed at the altar, seeking to avert the vengeance of the dead. Even in his propaganda, Alexander showed sophisticated understanding of the need to reconcile opposing narratives. The Persian response to Alexander's invasion was initially dismissive, a miscalculation that would prove fatal. The satraps of the western provinces met in council and decided to handle this young Macedonian upstart themselves without troubling the great king, Darius III. They had resources that seemed more than adequate, including substantial cavalry forces, Greek mercenary infantry who knew Macedonian tactics, and the wealth to hire more troops if needed. They chose to make their stand at the Granicus River in modern-day Turkey, planning to kill Alexander in his first battle and end the invasion before it properly began. The Persian strategy at Granicus was actually sound, even if their execution proved flawed. They positioned their cavalry along the steep riverbank, forcing Alexander to attack across the river and up the muddy slope. Their Greek mercenaries were positioned as a second line, ready to exploit any disorder in the Macedonian ranks. If Alexander attacked, he would be at a severe disadvantage. If he waited or tried to find another crossing, he would lose momentum and appear weak. It was a trap that should have worked. The Battle of the Granicus, fought in May of 334 before the Common Era, nearly ended Alexander's career before it truly began. His generals, including the experienced Parmenion, advised waiting until dawn to find a better crossing point upstream. It was sensible advice that any reasonable commander would have taken. But Alexander understood that his reputation for invincibility was his greatest weapon. To hesitate at the first obstacle would undermine the myth he was building. He ordered an immediate attack, personally leading the companion cavalry across the river in the face of the enemy. The crossing was chaos. Horses struggled in the current and slipped on the muddy riverbed. The far bank was steep and slippery, forcing cavalry to dismount or fight at a severe disadvantage. Persian nobles converged on Alexander, easily identifiable in his distinctive helmet with white plumes that made him stand out like a beacon. They understood that killing him would end not just the battle but the entire invasion. Spears thrust at him from all directions, and his shield was soon bristling with broken points. A Persian noble named Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius himself, struck Alexander with his sword, denting his helmet. Alexander ran him through with his lance, but as he struggled to free his weapon, another Persian, Rosacus, struck him on the head with such force that it broke through his helmet and drew blood. Alexander, dazed but still fighting, managed to kill Rosacus with his sword. But behind him, unseen, Rosacus' brother Mithridates raised his scimitar for a killing blow. At that critical moment, Clytus the Black, commander of the royal squadron and son of Alexander's childhood nurse, severed Mithridates' arm with a single sword stroke. The Persian's blade fell harmlessly as he screamed and toppled from his horse. It would not be the last time Alexander owed his life to the loyalty and alertness of his companions. The image of the young king, blood streaming from his head wound, continuing to fight while surrounded by enemies, became legendary among his troops. Gradually, more Macedonians crossed the river and gained the bank. The Persian cavalry, designed for mobility on open ground, found themselves pressed into close combat where the Macedonian lances had advantage. Once the companion cavalry had secured a foothold, the phalanx began crossing. The sight of those bristling sarissa points advancing in perfect formation broke Persian morale. The cavalry fled, leaving the Greek mercenaries to face the Macedonians alone. Alexander's treatment of the Greek mercenaries revealed the dual nature of his campaign. These were fellow Greeks, but they had chosen to serve the Persian Empire against the Pan-Hellenic crusade. Alexander surrounded them and, despite their request for terms, ordered an attack. The slaughter was deliberate and brutal. Of perhaps 5,000 Greek mercenaries, only 2,000 survived to be sent to Macedonia as slaves. The message was clear that Greeks who served Persia were traitors who could expect no mercy. The victory at Granicus opened Asia Minor to Alexander like a key turning a lock. revealing the vast expanse of the Persian Empire that lay before him like a feast waiting to be consumed. As news of the battle spread through the ancient communication networks of merchants and travelers, cities that had groaned under Persian rule for generations suddenly saw hope in this young Macedonian king who had done what seemed impossible, defeating the Persian cavalry that had been considered invincible for over 2 centuries. Alexander moved swiftly to capitalize on his success, understanding that momentum and conquest was like fire that needed constant fuel to keep burning. But his approach revealed a sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and political psychology that belied his 22 years. Rather than simply conquering through brute force, he positioned himself as a liberator, especially to the Greek cities of the Ionian coast that had been under Persian control since the failed Ionian revolt over a century earlier, a revolt whose brutal suppression still lived in Greek memory like an unhealed wound. At Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, and one of the most important Persian strongholds in Asia Minor, a city whose wealth had made Croesus legendary throughout the ancient world, the Persian garrison commander Mithranes made a calculation that would be repeated many times throughout Alexander's. Standing on the massive walls that had protected Sardis for centuries, seeing the fate of those who had resisted at Granicus and recognizing the futility of defending against Alexander's siege equipment that had been perfected by Philip's engineers, he made the pragmatic choice to surrender the city without a fight. Alexander's treatment of Mithranes was masterful, showing a political sophistication that would have impressed even the cynical Persian court. Rather than punishing him as a traitor to his Persian masters, which would have been expected and perhaps even demanded by traditional rules of war, Alexander appointed him to a position of honor in his own administration, making him a living example of the rewards of cooperation. The message spread quickly through the Persian administrative network that cooperation with Alexander brought rewards, not retribution, and that this young conqueror understood the value of experienced administrators. The contrast between Alexander's treatment of Greek and non-Greek cities revealed his political acumen and his ability to adapt his message to different audiences. At Ephesus, where pro-Persian oligarchs had recently massacred democratic leaders in a night of blood that still haunted the city's memory, Alexander restored democracy and redirected the tribute that had gone to Persia toward the reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that had been damaged by fire on the very night of Alexander's birth, a coincidence the priests were quick to emphasize. The symbolism was perfect and deliberate. The wealth that had flowed east to Persian treasuries would now remain in Greek hands, serving Greek gods. When he offered to pay for the temple's completion himself, inscribing his name as benefactor on every stone, the Ephesians diplomatically declined with remarkable tact, saying it was not fitting for one god to dedicate a temple to another. This early deification, while it might have seemed presumptuous to modern sensibilities, would become a recurring theme in Alexander's relationship with conquered peoples who found it easier to accept defeat from a god than from a mere mortal. But not every city welcomed Alexander with open arms and scattered rose petals. Miletus, despite having a significant Greek population who might have been expected to welcome liberation, chose to resist, trusting in its strong walls that had stood for centuries and the promise of support from the Persian fleet that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The city's leaders calculated that Alexander's success at Granicus might have been luck, and that the full weight of Persian naval power would soon crush this upstart Macedonian. Alexander's siege of Miletus demonstrated his growing sophistication in combined operations and his ability to think in 3 dimensions. He seized the island of Lade, controlling access to Miletus's harbors like a hand closing around a throat. And when the Persian fleet of 400 ships arrived, their admirals found the harbors blocked by Alexander's smaller but strategically positioned fleet. Without the ability to resupply by sea, with Alexander's siege engines pounding their walls day and night, Miletus fell within weeks, its resistance crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. It was after Miletus that Alexander made one of his most controversial and seemingly counterintuitive early decisions. Standing on the captured docks, watching the Persian fleet maneuver impotently outside the harbor, he disbanded most of his own fleet, keeping only enough ships to maintain basic communications and transport. His admirals were stunned, arguing vehemently against what seemed like strategic suicide. How could he hope to defeat the Persian Empire while ceding control of the sea to their superior navy that could land troops anywhere along the coast? Alexander's reasoning was both economic and strategic, showing a maturity of thought that would have impressed his teacher Aristotle. The fleet was expensive to maintain, draining gold that could better equip land forces, and he lacked the resources to match Persian naval power directly in ship-to-ship combat. Instead, he would defeat the Persian fleet by capturing all their bases along the coast, making it impossible for them to operate in the eastern Mediterranean, turning their strength into irrelevance. It was a bold gamble that would take 2 years to pay off completely, but it showed Alexander's ability to think beyond conventional strategy. The siege of Halicarnassus proved to be Alexander's first major test in siege warfare, a different kind of combat that required patience and engineering rather than the bold cavalry charges he preferred. The city was defended by Memnon of Rhodes, the same Greek mercenary commander who had argued for a scorched earth strategy before Granicus, a man who understood how Alexander thought because he thought the same way. Memnon had spent months preparing Halicarnassus for siege, deepening moats until they were too wide for siege towers to cross, strengthening walls with additional layers of brick and stone, and positioning catapults with overlapping fields of fire. The Persian garrison included some of their best troops, veterans who had fought in campaigns from Egypt to India, and the harbor remained open to resupply from the Persian fleet that brought fresh troops and supplies every night. For weeks that stretched into months, Alexander's forces assaulted the walls while Memnon's defenders conducted aggressive sorties to destroy the Macedonian siege equipment, sometimes fighting pitched battles in the no-man's land between the walls and the Macedonian camp. The fighting was brutal and costly, a grinding attrition that was the antithesis of Alexander's preferred mobile warfare. Alexander himself led from the front, as always, refusing to ask his men to take risks he wouldn't share. He was nearly killed when a catapult stone struck near him during an assault on the walls, showering him with fragments that left scars he would carry for the rest of his short life. The siege became a contest of engineering as much as courage, with both sides digging tunnels that sometimes met underground in desperate fights by torchlight, building towers that grew taller with each iteration, and employing increasingly sophisticated tactics that would be studied in military academies for centuries. The breakthrough came when Alexander's engineers, led by Diades of Thessaly, managed to bring down a section of wall using a combination of battering rams and undermining. But Memnon had prepared for this, constructing a semicircular inner wall behind the expected breach that turned the breakthrough into a trap. The fighting in the breach was savage, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage as men fought over the rubble in conditions that resembled the worst nightmares of the underworld. Finally, recognizing that the city would eventually fall and wanting to preserve his forces for future battles, Memnon set fire to the city's military equipment and withdrew his best troops by sea under cover of darkness and smoke, leaving Halicarnassus to Alexander but denying him a complete victory and the supplies he had hoped to capture. As winter approached with its storms that made naval operations dangerous and mountain passes treacherous, Alexander made another unexpected decision that showed his understanding of morale and logistics. Rather than keeping his entire army together in winter quarters where they would consume supplies and grow restless, he sent newly married soldiers, including many of his officers, back to Macedonia to spend the winter with their wives. This gesture earned him tremendous loyalty from his troops who saw that their king understood they were men with families, not just warriors, and also served a practical purpose that revealed Alexander's strategic thinking. These soldiers would return in spring with reinforcements, spreading tales of Alexander's victories through every village and town in Macedonia and Greece, encouraging recruitment and ensuring political support from the home front. Alexander himself spent the winter of 334 to 333 BCE conquering the rest of Asia Minor, refusing to rest while there was territory to be gained. His route took him through Lycia and Pamphylia, regions of stunning natural beauty and strategic importance, where local legends would later claim that the sea itself retreated to let him pass along a coastal road usually submerged by waves. Whether divine intervention or simply good timing with the tides that Alexander's scouts had carefully observed, Alexander never discouraged such stories that enhanced his reputation for divine favor. He understood that in the ancient world, the perception of divine support could be as valuable as an extra 1,000 soldiers. In Phrygia, at the ancient city of Gordium that had been old when the Persians were still nomads, Alexander encountered the legendary Gordian knot that would become one of the defining symbols of his approach to problems. According to prophecy that everyone in Asia knew, whoever could untie this impossibly complex knot would become ruler of Asia. The knot, made from the bark of a cornel tree and weathered by centuries until it was hard as iron, secured an ancient wagon supposedly belonging to Gordius, father of the legendary King Midas, whose touch turned everything to gold. Countless ambitious men had tried and failed to untie it over the centuries, their failures adding to its mystique. Alexander studied the knot, walking around it, examining it from every angle while his companions and local priests watched in tense silence. Then, according to most sources, he simply drew his sword and cut through it with one decisive stroke. Whether he actually cut it or found a clever way to remove the pin holding it together, pulling the yoke apart to reveal the rope's ends, his solution demonstrated the directness that characterized his approach to seemingly impossible problems. That night, thunder and lightning blessed his solution, or so his propagandists claimed, and the gods themselves seemed to ratify his destiny to rule Asia. Spring of 333 BCE brought news that concentrated Alexander's mind wonderfully and shifted the entire strategic situation. Memnon of Rhodes had died of illness while conducting naval operations in the Aegean, possibly poisoned, though more likely felled by one of the many diseases that plagued ancient armies. With him died the most competent of Darius's commanders, and the only one who truly understood how to fight Alexander by avoiding direct confrontation and using Persia's strategic depth. But more importantly, intelligence arrived that Darius himself was approaching with the main Persian army, having finally assembled the full might of his empire, determined to crush this Macedonian upstart personally and restore Persian prestige. The two armies converged on the narrow coastal plain near Issus, like two storms drawn together by fate, where the mountains of Anatolia meet the Mediterranean Sea in a geographical bottleneck that had seen armies clash for millennia. It was November 333 BCE, and through a series of intelligence failures and miscommunications that would have been comic if the stakes weren't so high, the armies had actually passed each other in opposite directions through different mountain passes, like dancers missing their cue. When Alexander learned that Darius was now behind him, cutting off his supply lines and his route home, he immediately turned his army around and marched back north to face the great king, showing no hesitation despite the strategic disadvantage. The battlefield at Issus negated many of Darius's advantages in a twist of fortune that seemed to confirm Alexander's divine favor. The narrow plain, only about 2.5 miles wide and bordered by mountains on one side and sea on the other, meant Darius couldn't fully deploy his numerical superiority, estimated at anywhere from 200,000 to 600,000 troops against Alexander's 35,000. The Persian army was packed so tightly that most units couldn't maneuver, like a giant trying to fight in a closet. Darius positioned his forces with the Pinaris River in front, its banks reinforced with stockades that his engineers had worked through the night to construct. His best troops, including Greek mercenaries who fought with the bitter determination of exiles, and his personal guard of 10,000 immortals, held the center. Cavalry protected both flanks, though the broken ground on his left limited their effectiveness, negating one of Persia's traditional advantages. Alexander surveyed the field with the eye of a master tactician who had been studying battles since childhood. He placed his phalanx in the center, those steady Macedonian farmers who had become the best infantry in the world, the companion cavalry on the right under his personal command where he could strike the decisive blow, and Parmenion with the Thessalian cavalry on the left with explicit orders to hold at all costs, even if it meant their destruction. His plan was elegant in its simplicity, but required perfect timing and iron discipline. He would lead a devastating charge against the Persian left, break through like a spear point, then wheel to attack Darius's position in the center, creating panic that would ripple through the Persian ranks. The battle began with Alexander's characteristic explosive charge across the river, the companions following their king through the water that ran red with blood within minutes. The Persian cavalry on this flank, hampered by the rough terrain and surprised by the ferocity of the assault, couldn't withstand the impact of the companions who struck like a thunderbolt. Alexander punched through like a spear point piercing armor, then turned toward the Persian center where Darius commanded from his ornate chariot, surrounded by his elite guard called the Immortals, who were supposed to be replaced immediately when they fell, maintaining always the number of 10,000. Meanwhile, the situation grew desperate for the Macedonian center and left, testing the limits of their training and morale. The Greek mercenaries in Persian service fought with professional skill and perhaps extra motivation, knowing Alexander's harsh treatment of Greeks who fought against Greeks at Granicus. They pushed hard against the Macedonian phalanx, actually breaking through at several points where the terrain disrupted the formation, threatening to split Alexander's army in half. On the left, Parmenion found himself outnumbered and hard-pressed by Persian cavalry that seemed endless, wave after wave of horsemen throwing themselves at the Thessalian line. For a critical period that seemed to stretch forever, the battle hung in the balance like scales that could tip either way. Everything changed in a moment that would echo through history when Alexander's cavalry charge reached striking distance of Darius himself. The great king, seeing the Macedonian king cutting through his bodyguard like a scythe through wheat, his eyes blazing with an intensity visible even through the dust and chaos of battle, bearing down on him personally with that terrifying focus, made the decision that would haunt him forever and destroy his reputation. He fled. The Emperor of Persia, master of millions, descendant of Cyrus the Great, turned his chariot and ran from a 23-year-old Macedonian who had been king for barely 3 years. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating, rippling through the Persian ranks like an earthquake. When Persian troops saw their god-king fleeing, their elaborate court protocols hadn't prepared them for this scenario. Panic spread through their ranks like wildfire in dry grass. What had been a contested battle became a rout within minutes. Alexander wanted to pursue Darius immediately, his blood up and glory within reach, but Parmenian's desperate situation on the left required his attention. By the time the Macedonian left was secure and pursuit could begin, Darius had too much of a head start, his fresh horses carrying him into the gathering darkness. He escaped, leaving behind his chariot with its golden fixtures, his bow that symbolized Persian royal authority, his royal cloak still warm from his body, and even his family who had been traveling with the army in royal comfort. The capture of Darius's family created one of the most famous episodes in Alexander's legend, a moment that would be painted and repainted by artists for centuries. His mother Sisygambes, a formidable woman who had survived Persian court intrigues for decades. His wife Stateira, considered the most beautiful woman in Asia. His daughters and his young son fell into Macedonian hands, along with the Persian baggage train containing treasures beyond imagination. That night, as the royal women wailed in grief, assuming Darius was dead and expecting the worst from their captors based on the usual fate of noble women in war, Alexander sent Leonidas to assure them of their safety. The next day, he visited them personally with Hephaestion, his closest companion since childhood, both young men dressed simply without royal regalia. When the two young men entered the tent, both dressed in plain armor still dusty from battle, Sisygambes mistook the taller and more physically imposing Hephaestion for Alexander, and began to prostrate herself before him in the Persian manner. Mortified when corrected by her attendants, she expected punishment for the insult that in Persian court could mean death. Instead, Alexander supposedly said with a smile, "You were not mistaken, mother, for he too is Alexander," a statement that revealed both his affection for Hephaestion and his understanding of how to win hearts through generosity. His treatment of the royal women became legendary throughout the ancient world. He addressed Sisygambes as mother, filling the void left by his own complicated relationship with Olympias, treated Darius's wife and daughters with complete respect despite their beauty and his power over them, and ensured they maintained their royal status and comfort. Later Persian sources would claim he fell in love with Darius's daughter Barsine, but if so, he never acted improperly toward her while she remained under his protection, understanding that his reputation for honor was worth more than any momentary pleasure. The victory at Issus transformed the strategic situation completely, like turning over a game board and starting fresh. Alexander captured not just Darius's family but his war chest, containing enough gold to fund the campaign for years without requesting money from Macedonia. More importantly, he had defeated the great king in personal combat, shattering the myth of Persian invincibility that had persisted since Xerxes. Cities and satraps who might have resisted now reconsidered their positions, understanding that if the great king himself could flee from Alexander, resistance might be futile. Yet Alexander made a curious choice that puzzled his generals and has intrigued historians ever since. Instead of pursuing Darius into the heart of the Persian Empire, striking while the iron was hot and Persian morale was shattered, he turned south toward the Mediterranean coast. His reasoning was sound if one understood his strategic vision. He needed to complete his strategy of defeating the Persian fleet by capturing all their bases, denying them any safe harbor in the Mediterranean. Moreover, Egypt, the wealthiest satrapy of the Persian Empire with its vast grain production, lay to the south, and its conquest would secure his financial position while denying resources to Darius, who was desperately trying to raise another army. Most cities along the Phoenician coast surrendered without resistance, their leaders understanding that resistance was futile after Issus and preferring to negotiate favorable terms. Byblos and Sidon welcomed Alexander, their populations tired of Persian domination and the heavy taxes that funded wars they had no interest in. But Tyre, the greatest naval power of the eastern Mediterranean and mother city of Carthage, proved different. Built on an island half a mile from shore, with walls 150 feet high that had been built by the greatest engineers of antiquity and possessing a powerful fleet that controlled the surrounding waters. Tyre had never fallen to a siege. The Tyrians believed their city was impregnable, protected by the sea itself. When Alexander demanded entry to sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, his supposed divine ancestor, the Tyrians offered a diplomatic compromise. He could sacrifice at the temple in the old city on the mainland, but not in the island city itself, where the real power and wealth lay. Alexander's response to this diplomatic slight was to undertake one of the most ambitious sieges in ancient history, a feat of engineering that would have been considered impossible by any rational assessment. If Tyre was an island, he would make it a peninsula, reshaping geography itself to serve his will. He ordered his engineers to build a causeway from the mainland to the island, half a mile long and 200 feet wide, solid enough to support siege towers and catapults. The project was staggering in scope, requiring enormous quantities of stone from demolished buildings, timber from the forests of Lebanon, and human labor that would have built pyramids. For months, the construction continued under constant attack that tested the ingenuity of both sides. Tyrian ships filled with combustibles and brave volunteers rammed the causeway's protective towers in suicide attacks. Divers cut the binding ropes underwater, working in shifts to avoid detection. Catapults from the city walls bombarded the workers, forcing Alexander to develop new protective structures. Alexander responded with equal innovation, building floating batteries on commandeered ships that could attack from different angles, constructing massive siege towers taller than any previously built, and eventually assembling a fleet from his newly conquered Phoenician cities to blockade Tyre from the sea, turning their maritime advantage against them. The siege lasted 7 months, from January to July 332 BCE, becoming a contest of wills as much as engineering. When the walls finally fell to Alexander's siege engines, which had been modified specifically to deal with Tyre's unique defenses, his troops' pent-up frustration exploded in an orgy of violence that shocked even ancient observers accustomed to brutality. 8,000 Tyrians died in the fighting, their bodies piling up in the streets. Alexander, in one of his harsher moments that revealed the darker side of his nature, ordered 2,000 survivors crucified along the beach, their dying screams carried by the wind as a warning to others who might resist. The remaining 30,000 were sold into slavery, their fate serving as an example throughout the region. The causeway he built still exists today, having accumulated sand over the millennia to permanently join Tyre to the mainland, a lasting monument to Alexander's determination to let no obstacle stand in his way. While besieging Tyre, Alexander received an offer from Darius that would have satisfied any reasonable conqueror. The Persian king proposed to cede all territory west of the Euphrates River, essentially half his empire, including the wealthy provinces of Asia Minor and Syria, pay 10,000 talents of gold that would make Alexander richer than any Greek had ever been, and offer his daughter in marriage to seal the alliance. When Alexander presented this offer to his council, Parmenion, speaking with the wisdom of his years, supposedly said, "If I were Alexander, the first would accept." Alexander's reply became legendary and revealed his unlimited ambition. "So would I if I were Parmenion." He rejected the offer completely, sending back word that he would have all of the Persian Empire or none of it. That Darius could keep his gold since Alexander would soon possess all Persian treasuries, and that he didn't need Darius's permission to marry his daughter since she was already his. Captive. Gaza, the last major fortress before Egypt and the gateway to that ancient land, fell after a 2-month siege marked by Alexander's growing ruthlessness and perhaps the psychological toll of constant warfare. The city was defended by Baptiste, a unit commander of remarkable courage who refused all offers of surrender. When a catapult bolt wounded Alexander in the shoulder, penetrating his armor and requiring painful extraction, his anger turned savage. After the city fell following brutal street-by-street fighting, he had the commander Baptiste dragged alive behind a chariot around the walls until dead, deliberately echoing Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad. It was a sign that the pressures of constant warfare and the intoxication of continuous victory were beginning to affect Alexander's character, bringing out a cruelty that would have horrified his teacher Aristotle. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator in late 332 BCE, the population lining the roads and throwing flowers before his army. The Persians had never been popular rulers there, having twice conquered Egypt with considerable brutality, destroying temples and carrying off sacred objects. The Persian satrap, recognizing the futility of resistance and perhaps influenced by generous bribes, surrendered without opposition. Alexander showed remarkable sensitivity to Egyptian culture and religion, understanding that respect for local traditions would win more loyalty than any number of garrisons. At Memphis, the ancient capital where pharaohs had been crowned for 3,000 years, he sacrificed to the Apis bull according to exact ritual requirements and was crowned pharaoh according to ancient traditions that predated even Greek civilization. The Egyptian priests, masters of surviving conquerors having dealt with Persians, Nubians, and others, immediately recognized him as the son of Ra, giving him the theological legitimacy the Persians had never achieved despite their military dominance. But it was Alexander's journey to the Oracle of Ammon at Siwa Oasis that would have the most profound impact on his self-conception and future behavior, marking a transformation in how he viewed himself and his destiny. The journey itself was arduous and dangerous, requiring a march of hundreds of miles through the Libyan desert, where bones of previous armies marked the route. When sandstorms disoriented his guides and the army faced death from thirst, legend claims that ravens appeared to lead them to the oasis, and that rain fell in the desert for the first time in memory, though more likely his guides recovered their bearings and found known water sources. What exactly the priest of Ammon told Alexander remains one of history's mysteries that has fascinated scholars for over 2 millennia. Alexander never revealed the specific prophecy, saying only that he had learned what he wished to know and that the god had answered his questions about his destiny. But from this point forward, he increasingly presented himself as the son of Zeus Ammon, a divine figure rather than merely a mortal king, adding Egyptian and divine elements to his royal presentation. Whether he believed this literally or understood it as useful propaganda remains debated, though perhaps the distinction mattered less to ancient minds than to modern ones, as the line between divine favor and divine parentage was often blurred. During his stay in Egypt, Alexander founded the most famous of his many Alexandrias at the mouth of the Nile Delta, personally involved in every aspect of its planning. He personally paced out the main streets with his architects, designated areas for temples to both Greek and Egyptian gods, showing his policy of cultural fusion, and positioned the marketplace and harbor to take advantage of prevailing winds and currents. The city's location was strategically brilliant, connecting Egypt's grain wealth to Mediterranean trade routes while being defensible from both land and sea. Within a generation, Alexandria would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a center of learning and commerce that preserved Greek culture for centuries and gave birth to innovations in science, mathematics, and philosophy that would shape human knowledge. By spring of 331 BCE, Alexander was ready for the final confrontation with Darius, who had not been idle during Alexander's southern campaign. The Persian king had spent the 18 months since Issus assembling a new army, this one even larger than before, drawing on the vast manpower reserves of the eastern satrapies. He had stripped the eastern provinces of troops, bringing warriors from Bactria, Sogdiana, India, and the steppes of Central Asia, fighters who had different traditions and tactics than the Western forces Alexander had faced. He had prepared special weapons, including scythed chariots designed to break up phalanx formations and war elephants that would terrify horses and men alike. Most importantly, he had chosen the battlefield carefully, selecting a broad plain near Gaugamela where his numerical superiority could be fully deployed without the geographical constraints that had hampered him at Issus. Alexander marched from Egypt through Syria and Mesopotamia with the confidence of a commander who had never lost a battle, crossing the Euphrates and Tigris rivers unopposed because Darius had failed to defend these crucial barriers. Darius had learned from Memnon's strategy and adopted a scorched earth approach, but only partially and ineffectively, burning crops to deny supplies but failing to destroy the vital river crossings that would have seriously delayed Alexander. As the Macedonian army approached Gaugamela in late September, scouts reported the Persian army's size as so vast that its campfires seemed to cover the entire plain like stars, stretching beyond the horizon in every direction. The night before the battle, Parmenion suggested a night attack to negate the Persian numerical advantage, arguing that darkness would create confusion that would favor the smaller, more disciplined Macedonian force. Alexander's refusal was both practical and philosophical, revealing his understanding of the importance of decisive victory. Night battles were notoriously chaotic and unpredictable, and he wanted a decisive victory that would end the war, not one that Darius could trickery or fortune. "I will not steal victory," he declared with the confidence of youth and genius, then retired to sleep so soundly that his officers had to wake him on the morning of battle, October 1st, 331 BCE, a date that would mark the end of the Persian Empire that had dominated the ancient world for over 2 centuries. The battlefield at Gaugamela presented Alexander with his greatest tactical challenge, a test that would prove whether his genius could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Darius had cleared and leveled the ground to give maximum advantage to his chariots and cavalry, even having his engineers smooth out irregularities that might trip horses. The Persian line stretched perhaps 2 miles or more, dramatically overlapping the Macedonian line on both flanks like a giant crescent moon preparing to envelop its prey. Modern estimates suggest Darius commanded between 200,000 and 1,000,000 men against Alexander's 47,000, though ancient numbers are notoriously unreliable. The Persians had every advantage except one: they faced Alexander, and that would prove decisive. Alexander's battle plan was his most sophisticated yet, showing an evolution in his tactical thinking born from experience. He arranged his forces in an unusual formation that military historians still study, with the phalanx in the center and cavalry on both wings as usual, but with a second line of reserves behind and flank guards bent back at angles to protect against encirclement. The entire formation could move like a mobile fortress, protecting itself from all directions while maintaining offensive capability, adapting to threats as they developed. As the battle began, Alexander led his companion cavalry obliquely to the right, a maneuver that seemed strange but had multiple calculated purposes. This movement drew the Persian left to follow him, extending their line and taking the fight away from the ground. Darius had carefully prepared for his scythed chariots. It also gradually created a gap in the Persian line as their left extended to prevent being outflanked, like stretching taffy until it begins to thin. The Persian chariots, when they charged with their terrible scythes spinning, proved less effective than Darius hoped. Alexander's light troops opened their ranks to let them pass through, then attacked them from behind with javelins, while the horses, faced with a forest of sarissa points from the phalanx, often turned aside or were brought down by arrows. The critical moment came when Alexander detected the gap in the Persian line created by his oblique movement, a weakness that existed for only moments, forming his companions into a wedge with himself at the point. As always, leading from the front where the danger was greatest, he charged directly at Darius's position with the focused intensity of a lightning bolt. Once again, the sight of Alexander cutting through Persian nobles like death incarnate, driving straight at him with those heterochromatic eyes blazing with an almost supernatural intensity, broke Darius's nerve at the crucial moment. Once again, the great king fled the battlefield, his chariot racing away from danger while his army still fought. But unlike at Issus, the battle was far from over, demonstrating the quality of the forces Darius had assembled. The Persian right had broken through Alexander's left, and some units actually reached the Macedonian baggage camp, where they freed Persian prisoners and created chaos in what should have been a secure area. A gap had also opened in the Macedonian phalanx as it advanced unevenly over the rough ground, and Persian and Indian cavalry poured through like water through a broken dam, threatening to split Alexander's army. For a time, the battle raged on multiple fronts simultaneously, with the outcome genuinely uncertain despite Darius's flight. Alexander faced an agonizing decision that revealed his maturation as a commander. Should he pursue Darius and ensure the psychological victory that would end Persian resistance, or turn back to aid his embattled forces who might be destroyed without his intervention? He chose his army, wheeling the companions around to strike the Persian cavalry from behind in a maneuver that required perfect timing and discipline. This intervention, combined with the steady courage of the Macedonian infantry who held their ground despite being surrounded, and Parmenion's dogged defense on the left where he faced odds of perhaps 5-1, finally turned the tide decisively. As news of Darius's flight spread through the Persian ranks, carried by fleeing courtiers and visible in the panic of the royal guard, Persian resistance collapsed across the battlefield like a house of cards in a wind. The scale of the victory was absolute and world-changing. The Persian Empire's military power was broken forever, scattered to the winds like dust. Babylon, the empire's greatest city with its famous hanging gardens and massive walls, surrendered without resistance, its priests welcoming Alexander as the legitimate successor to their ancient kings and performing rituals that hadn't been seen since Nebuchadnezzar. Susa, with its vast treasuries containing the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries of Persian rule, tribute from dozens of nations, fell into his hands intact. The gold and silver found there was so massive that it required 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to transport it, wealth that would fund armies and building projects for generations. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire where the great kings had held court for centuries, Alexander encountered a group of Greek prisoners who had been mutilated by their Persian captors. their hands or feet cut off to prevent escape while keeping them useful as skilled workers in a display of calculated cruelty. The sight of these maimed countrymen, living reminders of Persian brutality, enraged the Macedonians and perhaps helped justify what followed. After allowing his troops to loot the city for months, carrying off treasures that had been accumulated over centuries but sparing only the palace complex initially, Alexander held a drinking party that ended with the palace complex itself in flames. The burning of Persepolis remains controversial among historians, debated as either deliberate policy or drunken impulse. Ancient sources differ on whether it was suggested by the Athenian courtesan Thais seeking revenge for the Persian burning of Athens, or planned by Alexander as a symbolic end to the War of Revenge. The symbolism was clear either way to everyone in the ancient world. The palace from which Xerxes had launched his invasion of Greece 150 years earlier, where he had planned the destruction of Greek temples, was destroyed in return. The Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge was complete, the debt paid in full. Yet Alexander immediately regretted the destruction, understanding that as the new ruler of Persia, he had destroyed his own property and alienated his Persian subjects who saw it as sacrilege against their heritage. Darius fled eastward into the rising sun, still nominally great king, but with his authority evaporating like morning dew under the harsh sun of reality. Alexander pursued him relentlessly through the Iranian plateau, covering extraordinary distances at speeds that astonished ancient commentators who thought such marches impossible. His advance guard sometimes rode 70 miles in a day through hostile terrain, changing horses at prearranged points driven by Alexander's iron will. The chase became a race between Alexander and Darius's own courtiers, particularly Bessus, satrap of Bactria, who saw opportunity in the chaos and believed he could rally the eastern provinces against Alexander. In July 330 BCE, near the Caspian Gates that marked the boundary between the Persian heartland and the wild eastern provinces, Bessus and his conspirators made their move. They arrested Darius, loading him in chains into a wagon like a common criminal, stripping him of the royal regalia that symbolized his divine authority. When Alexander's pursuit grew too close, when they could hear the thunder of Macedonian hooves approaching, they stabbed the great king multiple times and left him to die by the roadside like a dog. A Macedonian scout named Polystratus found him still alive, blood pooling beneath him, and Darius allegedly had time to ask that Alexander avenge his murder before dying, though this conversation may be propaganda to legitimize Alexander's subsequent actions. The death of Darius marked a crucial transition that changed the entire nature of Alexander's campaign. Alexander gave Darius a funeral befitting a great king, sending his body to Persepolis for burial in the royal tombs alongside his ancestors, performing all the proper rituals. He then assumed the title of King of Asia and began the pursuit of Bessus, who had declared himself Artaxerxes V and wore the upright tiara that only the great king could wear. But this was no longer a Macedonian conquest of Persia, a foreign invasion. It was now a war of succession within the Persian Empire itself, with Alexander positioning himself as Darius's legitimate heir, avenging his predecessor's murder, a role that Persian nobles could understand and accept. This transformation in Alexander's role coincided with changes in his behavior and self-presentation that disturbed his Macedonian companions who had known him since childhood. He began wearing elements of Persian royal dress, the purple and white robes that marked Persian royalty, though ancient sources disagree on the extent and whether he wore them constantly or only on certain occasions. He adopted the Persian court ceremonial with its elaborate rituals, including the requirement that subjects prostrate themselves before him in the ritual called proskynesis. To Persians, this was simply court etiquette that had been practiced for centuries. But to Greeks and Macedonians, who prostrated themselves only before gods, it smacked of blasphemy and oriental despotism that betrayed everything they had fought for. The adoption of Persian customs served practical purposes that revealed Alexander's sophisticated understanding of imperial administration. Alexander now ruled an empire stretching from the Aegean to Central Asia, containing dozens of different peoples with radically different cultures, languages, and traditions. He needed to be acceptable as a ruler to all of them, not just to Macedonians who numbered perhaps 50,000 out of millions of subjects. His adoption of local customs in each region, what modern historians call his policy of fusion, was remarkably sophisticated for its time, anticipating methods of imperial rule that wouldn't be fully developed until the Roman Empire. He appointed Persians to governorships, understanding that they knew the local conditions better than Macedonian newcomers. He integrated Persian units into his army, creating mixed formations that would share loyalty. He encouraged marriages between his soldiers and local women, creating families that would have stakes in both cultures. But to his Macedonian old guard, veterans who had served his father Philip and remembered when Macedonia was a backwater kingdom, these changes represented a betrayal of their values and his father's legacy. The tensions exploded in a series of conspiracies and confrontations that marked Alexander's transformation from Macedonian king to Eastern despot, each incident driving a deeper wedge between him and his oldest companions. The first serious conspiracy, led by Philotas, son of Parmenion and commander of the companion cavalry since the beginning of the campaign, was discovered in 330 BCE in the eastern provinces. Whether Philotas was actively involved or merely failed to report it when he learned of it remains unclear, lost in the accusations and torture that followed, but Alexander had him tried before the army and executed after extracting a confession under torture. More shocking was what followed, an act that revealed the cold pragmatism beneath Alexander's heroic exterior. Parmenion, the 70-year-old general who had served Philip loyally for decades and led Alexander's left wing in every major battle, who had been like a second father to many of the young Macedonian nobles, was too powerful to leave alive after his son's execution. Alexander sent assassins racing across the desert on racing camels, changing mounts to maintain speed, carrying sealed orders. They had to kill Parmenion before news of Philotas's death could reach him and give him time to revolt with the treasury and troops under his command. The old general was reading a letter from Alexander, probably expecting news of victories, when the killers struck. With Parmenion's death, the last link to Philip's generation of leadership was severed, and Alexander stood alone at the apex of power. The pursuit of Bessus led Alexander into the harsh territories of what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, regions that would test his army like nothing before, where the enemies were the landscape and climate as much as human opponents. The guerrilla warfare in Bactria and Sogdiana was completely different from the set-piece battles against Persian armies where victory was clear and decisive. Local warlords would submit when Alexander appeared with his army in overwhelming force, then revolt the moment he moved on to the next valley, requiring the same territories to be conquered repeatedly. Cities had to be taken multiple times, their populations growing more hostile with each conquest. The fighting was brutal and without rules, with no quarter given on either side, atrocities breeding atrocities in an endless cycle. It was during these campaigns that Alexander committed some of his harshest acts, revealing a ruthlessness that grew with frustration. When the city of Serapolis revolted after surrendering, breaking their oaths of loyalty, he had all male inhabitants killed and the women and children sold into slavery. At the Sogdian Rock, deemed impregnable by its defenders who taunted Alexander to find soldiers with wings if he wanted to take it, he had 300 volunteers scale the cliff face at night with tent pegs and ropes, many falling to their deaths in the darkness. When the defenders saw Macedonians above them at dawn, standing on peaks they thought impossible to reach, they surrendered in shock, believing Alexander commanded supernatural forces. Alexander had all the defenders executed as an example to others who might trust in geographical advantages. Yet it was also in Sogdiana that Alexander found love, or at least political advantage dressed as romance in a story that would inspire poetry for centuries. At another mountain fortress called the Rock of Sogdiana, he captured the family of a Bactrian noble named Oxyartes, including his daughter Roxana, whose name meant Little Star in Persian. Ancient sources, perhaps romanticizing for their audiences who loved a good love story, claim Alexander fell in love at first sight with the beautiful Roxana when she danced at a feast. More likely, he recognized the political value of marrying a local noblewoman from an influential family. The wedding, conducted in Persian fashion with the sharing of bread that symbolized union, helped reconcile some of the Bactrian nobility to his rule, showing that he respected their traditions and would make their daughters queens, not concubines. The marriage to Roxana further alienated traditional Macedonians who expected their king to marry a Macedonian or at least a Greek woman to produce legitimate heirs that would be culturally Macedonian. The tensions culminated in the most personally painful incident of Alexander's reign, a tragedy that would haunt him for his remaining years. At a drinking party in Mariconda in 328 BCE, where wine flowed freely and tongues loosened dangerously, Clytus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at Granicus by cutting off the arm of the Persian noble about to strike him down, began drunkenly criticizing the king. He mocked Alexander's Persian dress, calling him a peacock, his claim to be the son of Zeus rather than Philip, and his dismissal of Philip's achievements in creating the army that had won Alexander's victories. Alexander, also drunk on unmixed wine that was stronger than usual, flew into a rage that shocked even those who knew his temper. As friends tried to hustle Clytus away, Understanding the danger, he shouted that Alexander was no better than Darius, surrounded by flatterers and slaves instead of free Macedonians who spoke truth. Alexander grabbed a spear from a guard and ran Clitus through the chest, the point emerging from his back. The instant the spear penetrated, as Clitus's blood splashed on Alexander's hands, Alexander's rage evaporated like mist, replaced by horror at what he had done. He tried to turn the spear on himself, to follow his friend into death before friends wrestled it away. For 3 days he locked himself in his tent, refusing food and water, calling for Clitus and weeping like a child, tearing his clothes and striking his head against the ground. The army, fearing for their king's life and their own survival in hostile territory surrounded by enemies, passed a retroactive verdict that Clitus had been guilty of treason, a legal fiction that satisfied no one. This verdict allowed Alexander to emerge from his tent and resume command, but the damage to his psyche and reputation was permanent and irreversible. The man who had saved his life at his first great battle, who had been like an older brother, had died by his hand in a drunken rage over words. The golden boy was tarnishing, the hero becoming a tyrant, the liberator becoming what he had fought against. Despite these internal conflicts that were tearing apart the Macedonian leadership, Alexander's military genius remained undimmed, perhaps even sharpened by the challenges of mountain warfare. In 327 BCE, he began planning his most ambitious campaign yet. The invasion of India, a land that existed in Greek imagination as a place of wonders and monsters. To the Greeks, India was a semi-mythical land at the edge of the world, populated by dog-headed men and gold-digging ants the size of foxes. They believed that beyond India lay the endless ocean that encircled all land like a river around an island. By conquering India, Alexander would become master of the entire world, fulfilling a destiny greater than any hero of myth. The invasion of India required crossing the Hindu Kush mountains, which Alexander's army accomplished in spring despite snow that blinded men and altitude sickness that killed pack animals and weakened even the strongest soldiers. The paths were so narrow that men had to march in single file, and avalanches buried entire units. Descending into the Indus Valley after weeks of mountain agony, Alexander entered a world unlike anything Greeks had encountered, a land of monsoons that could drown a man standing upright, elephants that fought in battle lines, and jungle warfare where enemies could be invisible until they struck. The numerous kingdoms of India, some hostile and some welcoming, required careful diplomacy alongside military force, and Alexander showed he could negotiate as well as fight. The most formidable opponent was King Porus, who ruled the region between the Hydaspes and Assassines rivers, a giant of a man who stood nearly 7 feet tall and commanded respect through physical presence alone. Porus commanded an army that included 200 war elephants, a weapon that terrified horses and men alike with their trumpeting and earth-shaking charge. The Battle of the Hydaspes in May 326 BCE would be Alexander's last great set-piece battle, and perhaps his most tactically brilliant, fought in conditions that would have defeated most commanders. The Hydaspes River was swollen with monsoon rains when Alexander arrived, its current so strong that it swept away grown men. Porus waited on the opposite bank with his elephants, knowing that horses would not approach them, their scent alone causing panic. For days, Alexander made feints at different crossing points, wearing down Porus's vigilance by forcing him to march his forces back and forth. Then, on a stormy night when rain obscured vision and thunder covered sound, he led a force upstream to a crossing point he had identified earlier, crossed on boats and rafts hidden in inlets, and appeared on Porus's flank at dawn like an apparition from the storm. The battle was savage and unlike anything in Alexander's experience. His horses, as expected, panicked at the elephants, rearing and throwing riders, refusing to charge. But Alexander had prepared his men with new tactics developed from intelligence about elephant behavior. Light troops targeted the elephants' eyes with arrows and their hamstrings with axes, while avoiding their crushing feet and grasping trunks that could tear a man in half. When wounded elephants turned to flee, maddened by pain, they trampled their own troops in their panic. Porus fought magnificently from atop his war elephant, continuing even after multiple wounds, his nobility evident in his refusal to surrender while he could still fight. He only yielded when further resistance became pointless, his army destroyed and his body too wounded to continue. Alexander's treatment of Porus showed his evolution as a ruler, and perhaps a recognition of a kindred spirit. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied simply, "Like a king," a response that impressed Alexander with its dignity. Alexander not only restored his kingdom but added territory to it, making Porus a loyal vassal who would govern in Alexander's name. This generosity toward a brave enemy earned Alexander respect among Indian rulers and showcased a maturity absent in his earlier campaigns, a understanding that respect could win what force alone could not. But as Alexander pushed eastward toward the Ganges, his army's morale finally cracked like a dam that had held too much pressure for too long. At the Hyphasis River, after 70 days of monsoon rain that rotted leather, rusted metal, and broke spirits, facing reports of even greater Indian armies with thousands of elephants beyond, armies that made Porus look small, the Macedonian veterans who had marched from Europe to the edge of the known world said enough. They had been campaigning for 8 years without rest, marching 20,000 miles through every climate and terrain, fighting countless battles against every type of enemy. They wanted to go home to families they barely remembered, to spend the wealth they had won, to rest their scarred bodies. The mutiny at the Hyphasis was respectful but firm, a strike rather than a rebellion. Coenus, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders who had fought in every major battle, spoke for the army with the authority of shared hardship, pointing out that of the original troops who had crossed into Asia, few remained alive and unwounded. Those who survived were exhausted, wounded in body and spirit, and homesick for a Macedonia some had not seen since they were teenagers. They had followed Alexander to the ends of the earth, but they would go no further, not for glory, not for gold, not even for their beloved king. Alexander withdrew to his tent for 3 days, hoping the army would relent as they had before, but this time they held firm. When they didn't change their minds, he emerged and announced that the omens for crossing were unfavorable, using religion to save face. Face saved through this religious excuse that fooled no one but allowed everyone to pretend. He ordered the army to turn back. But first, showing his need to mark even this defeat as a kind of victory, he had 12 massive altars built on the riverbank to mark the eastern limit of his conquest, monuments to ambition's furthest reach. Legend claims he also had oversized furniture and weapons made and left behind to make future generations think giants had campaigned there, unable to resist mythologizing even in retreat.